That requires more resources, and the United States can afford those resources, as can Europe. It requires more emphasis to the mission of General Dayton, referred to by Khalil with respect to the quite exhilarating performance of Palestinian security services who are now loyal to the Palestinian Authority and not to one of its constituent parts. But these are resolvable problems. These are doable issues. So our fifth issue is to build institutions, and now we can do it within the framework of a Palestinian initiative, the initiative of Prime Minister Fayyad. And number 6, let's not forget that behaviors need to change. Now, the Obama administration didn't simply decide to try to get Israel to free settlements because it thought it was a good idea. The Obama administration started out on its track of policy with the idea of creating a better atmosphere in which all these other things could then take place. The problem, however, was that the policy became a roadblock in and of itself. And once the Obama administration was not ready to go to the mat, in other words, to go all the way for a settlements freeze, in effect, Netanyahu could go home claiming quote-unquote victory, when in fact victory meant nothing, because there was no peace process resulting from it. So the United States must continue to press Israel to free settlements. And I argue with anyone in this room who says that settlements cannot be totally frozen. They can be totally frozen. Any government in Israel that has allowed settlement construction, that has licensed it, that has permitted settlers to build, can also tell settlers that it's changed its policy. And if there are legal issues, if there are financial issues that have to be unwound as a result of this, that's for the Israeli government to work out. Settlements must stop. But the effort to get settlements must stop cannot be used as a barrier to achieve all these other purposes. On the Palestinian side, institutions must be built. Further efforts must be undertaken to root out whatever infrastructure of terrorism still exists. The effort last May, I think it was, in Qalqilia, is a shining star in Palestinian history, because it was a moment at which the Palestinian security forces, not to protect Israel, but to protect the PA, went after a group of bad people. And they went into a building and some people got killed, including among the security forces. That kind of effort must continue because it's in the Palestinian interest for there to be one gun, one authority, and one voice when it comes to law and order. So these behaviors, which are so detrimental to the success of the peace process, must change, and the effort to change those behaviors must continue even as we do all these other issues. But none of these should become a barrier to progress on the other fronts. Finally, I would note there is a thought out there, well, let's try to do borders first. In other words, let's try to find the shape of a Palestinian state, and then perhaps once that shape is known, it will help resolve part of the settlements issue, because whatever is outside those borders, presumably then Israel would be permitted to build, and will also give some sense for Palestinians of what it is that they're negotiating about. I happen to subscribe to the idea that a borders first negotiation is a good idea, but with a number of principles that have to be attached to it. And with that, I would conclude. Number one, that a borders territory agreement would reflect the equivalent of 100% of the territory of 1967. May not be inch by inch the same, but it will add up to 100% of the territory that was occupied in 1967. Number two, that in reaching this 100% outcome, there will be territorial swaps of 1-to-1 ratio in both size and quality. Number three, that there will be an equitable methodology for sharing natural resources which don't know borders, water and minerals and the like, will be done equitably and fairly. Number four, that the discussions on territory should, number one, or sub A, dislocate as few settlers as possible, which is doable if you look at a map. Number two, avoid as much as possible impacting on Palestinian daily life. Number three, ensure the contiguity and political economic viability of the Palestinian state that's going to emerge. And number 4, not include the idea of population swaps, which is, I think, a pernicious idea that has been raised by some. Now, with borders first negotiations, there have to be at least 3 simultaneous additional talks held. Number 1 is on Jerusalem, because if you're going to draw a border, it's going to include Jerusalem, and therefore you can't ignore the Jerusalem issue until the end of the negotiating process. But there are ideas to work through the Jerusalem issue. In 2000, President Clinton came up with the Clinton parameters. Less than a year ago, I co-published an article in Foreign Affairs with Ambassador Michael Bell of Canada that resulted from a study we had undertaken on a special regime for the Old City. Maybe that's not the idea that's going to win out in the end, but the point is that Jerusalem is not an unresolvable problem, and therefore negotiations on Jerusalem should be conducted simultaneously with the discussions on border. Number 2, there have to be discussions on the issue of safe passage. We've talked around and about the issue of Gaza, Hamas. The most immediate question is, how do you relink these 2 entities? And so there has to be a discussion on the issue of safe passage, which is part and parcel of Oslo. And number 3, there are territorial water issues related to the Dead Sea, which most of us don't pay attention to. But the Dead Sea potentially has some of the richest mineral resources anywhere in that region. And if an agreement can be reached on both the allocation of rights and then the exploitation of those minerals, it could go a long way to solve some of the financial issues that will result from these negotiations. So that's a reset table. I did not include Syria. I have a 1-line response on Syria, which is, why don't we get the parties back to the negotiating table? Thank you very much.
Let me thank all of our panelists. I think that the audience will have to agree we were given a very rich overview of the current Palestinian-Israeli situation, and Dan has put on the table a very interesting set of ideas on resetting the table. Let me, before I begin, to offer some Q&A. We're going to go a little later to 5:10 because we have so many questions and our panelists gave us so much to consider. I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and bundle a couple of questions, and let's first start with the settlements. All of the panelists addressed the issue of settlements, and I would like each of our panelists, we received many questions on settlements, ranging from basically what will it take for Obama to pressure Israel to freeze settlements? Are there implications for his reelection? But I want to go also and sort of take a couple of the questions that speak to the issue of what are the incentives and disincentives that might be offered to put on the table to address the issue of settlements. Dan, do you want to begin? And I'd like each of our panelists, if they would, address the question, please.